The monitor started beeping at 6:27 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I had written it into Arthur's chart just 12 minutes earlier. 12 minutes after Dr. Sinclair had called his death. 12 minutes after I had removed his cardiac leads with my own hands, covered his body with a clean white sheet, and picked up the telephone to tell his wife that her husband of 41 years was gone. I looked up at the central monitoring station out of pure reflex, the way nurses do when any alarm sounds, and what I saw made my hands go completely still. A normal sinus rhythm. 72 beats per minute, organized, clean, unmistakable. My first thought was a technical malfunction. I told myself that firmly as I walked toward Arthur's room, the way you grab onto something solid when the floor starts to tilt. I had removed those leads myself. I had been thorough. There was a logical explanation. There is always a logical explanation. I pushed open the door and stopped in the doorway. His chest was rising and falling beneath the sheet. I'm going to try to describe what that moment felt like, and I already know I'll fall short. 16 years in cardiac nursing had trained me to process and act without hesitation. That training completely abandoned me in that doorway. I stood there and stared, and my mind went utterly blank. Because I had checked Arthur's pulse. I had checked his pupils. I had watched the flat line hold steady for 10 full minutes before Dr. Sinclair made the call. His body had been cooling. I had felt the early onset of rigor settling into his hands when I positioned his arms. Arthur Kellerman was dead. I had verified it myself. I walked to his bedside on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and put 2 fingers against his neck. A strong, regular pulse, 72 beats per minute. "This is impossible," I whispered out loud, to nobody. And then I called for Dr. Sinclair. "My name is Karen Dalton. I spent 16 years as a cardiac ICU nurse at Cleveland Heart Institute in Ohio. Before that October morning, I had watched more people die than I can count. I had held the hands of families during final goodbyes, participated in codes that stretched past an hour, pronounced patients dead, covered bodies, called the morgue. Death was not a mystery to me. It was a clinical event with clear, definable criteria. Fixed pupils, no pulse, no electrical activity, dropping body temperature. I understood it completely. I had been certain I understood it for 16 years. Arthur Kellerman had come to us on a Tuesday in early October. 67 years old, a retired mechanical engineer who still consulted, still walked 3 miles every morning, still laughed easily and often. He had been admitted for what amounted to a lucky catch. A routine CT scan had found a 5.2 centimeter abdominal aortic aneurysm, and his vascular surgeon had recommended repair. The surgery went beautifully. 2 days later, Arthur was eating regular meals, walking the halls with physical therapy, and asking thoughtful questions about every monitor and line connected to his body. He was the kind of patient who stays with you, intelligent, warm, genuinely curious. He had worked on components for NASA's space shuttle program in the 80s and talked about it with quiet, unassuming pride. On our second night together, when he was restless, and we ended up talking for almost an hour, he looked at all the equipment surrounding his bed and said, "Nurse Dalton, you folks have this thing figured out better than we ever designed those shuttle systems." He made me smile. He still does. He was scheduled to go home Monday morning. On Saturday evening around 11:30, I heard irregular beats from Arthur's telemetry. Premature ventricular contractions, not uncommon after vascular surgery, often tied to electrolyte shifts. Blood work showed mildly low potassium and magnesium. We started intravenous replacement, and within a couple of hours Arthur had stabilized and was resting comfortably. At 3:45 a.m., everything changed. His monitor went off. ventricular tachycardia, a rhythm so fast the heart can't fill properly between beats. I was at his bedside in seconds. Arthur was conscious but pale and drenched in sweat, gripping the side rails. "Something's really wrong," he gasped. Dr. Sinclair performed synchronized cardioversion. One shock, and Arthur came back. We started amiodarone and watched him closely. At 5:20 a.m., the second episode hit. Faster and harder, 220 beats per minute, blood pressure nearly undetectable. Arthur lost consciousness within seconds. I called the code and started compressions immediately. What followed was 45 minutes of everything we had: 8 shocks, 6 rounds of epinephrine, antiarrhythmic after antiarrhythmic. Arthur's rhythm would organize briefly and then collapse back into chaos. At 6:05, his heart went into asystole, complete electrical silence. We continued CPR for another 10 minutes. There was no response to anything. Dr. Sinclair performed a final check. No pulse, no blood pressure, no pupillary response. She looked at the clock. Time of death, 6:15 a.m., October 15th, 2023. I had been in that room for over 2 hours. I began the post-mortem process the way I had done dozens of times, removed the leads, disconnected the lines, covered Arthur with a clean sheet, and positioned his arms at his sides. Then I walked to the nurse's station and picked up the phone to call his wife. That call is one of the hardest things a nurse does. You choose your words carefully, knowing that on the other end of the line someone's world is about to shift permanently. I told Eleanor what had happened. I told her she could come to the hospital. I told her I was so sorry. She went quiet for a moment, and then she started to cry, saying his name over and over. I stayed on the line until she could speak again. I hung up. I opened Arthur's chart to begin the documentation, and then the monitor beeped. When Dr. Sinclair arrived at Arthur's bedside 30 seconds after I called her, she stopped in the doorway exactly the way I had. She looked at his chest rising and falling. She looked at the monitor. She looked at me. "Karen," she said quietly, "help me understand what I'm seeing here." I told her everything, every check, every verification, every step of the protocol. She nodded and performed her own assessment. Heart rate, 72. Blood pressure, 110/65. Oxygen saturation, 94% on room air. Pupils equal and reactive to light. And his body temperature, 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal. As if the post-mortem cooling I had observed just minutes earlier had simply reversed itself, she shook Arthur gently by the shoulder. "Arthur, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly. He looked around the room with the expression of someone waking from a very long, very deep sleep. Dr. Sinclair, Nurse Dalton. He paused, taking in the room. "What happened? I feel like I've been asleep for a very long time." I could not speak. I genuinely could not find a single word. In the hours that followed, we ran every test available: blood work, EKGs, echocardiograms, CT scans, full neurological assessment. Every result came back not just normal, but actually improved from his pre-arrest values. His cardiac enzymes showed no evidence of damage. His brain was completely intact, despite 45 minutes of CPR and 12 additional minutes after we pronounced him dead. The arrhythmia that had nearly killed him was simply gone, as if it had never existed. "It's like his heart reset itself," Dr. Sinclair said to me during a quiet moment away from his room. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of cardiology. Medically speaking, what we witnessed should not be possible." By afternoon, the chief of cardiology had been in, the director of cardiac electrophysiology, the chief medical officer, researchers from Case Western Reserve. Each one reviewed the records, examined Arthur, and left shaking their head. No explanation, not one. Arthur himself was remarkably calm. On his second day back with us, when he had rested and gathered himself, he told me what he remembered. He said he recalled the chest pain, the difficulty breathing, and then darkness, but not like sleep. Different, in a way he struggled to put into words. He felt himself rise. He was floating above his own body, looking down at the room, watching us work. He could see me doing compressions. He wanted to tell us he was all right, that we didn't need to keep trying so hard, but there was no way to reach us. He watched me cover him with a sheet. He watched me walk to the nurse's station and make the phone call to Eleanor. He heard me say the words. Then he saw a light, not like any light he had ever seen before. Warm and peaceful, pulling him gently forward. He started moving toward it. And then he heard Eleanor's voice. Not from the phone, not from anywhere in the room. Just her voice, saying his name, crying, begging him not to leave her. And that sound pulled him back. I have thought about those words almost every single day since. I had heard near-death experience accounts from patients before. In 16 years, it wasn't unusual. But Arthur's account was different in a way that was hard to set aside. The specific things he described seeing, me pulling the sheet over him, me walking to the nurse's station, me picking up the phone. Those things happened after we pronounced him dead. After I had verified his death by every protocol I knew. If Arthur was observing his own room during those minutes we considered him gone, he was doing it from somewhere that has no place in any medical textbook I have ever read. What do you do with that? I know what I did. I researched. I read everything available about Lazarus syndrome. The spontaneous return of circulation after resuscitation is stopped. Fewer than 100 documented cases in all of medical literature. Most patients don't survive long or suffer serious neurological damage. Arthur's case was extraordinary, even within that extraordinary category. But the research didn't quiet the questions, it multiplied them. If Arthur had been conscious and aware while clinically dead, if he had genuinely seen and heard things in that room after we stopped working, what did that mean about every other patient I had pronounced dead over 16 years? Were they aware too? Were they listening to our conversations about prognosis, about end-of-life decisions? Were they frightened? The thought was almost unbearable to sit with. I started having anxiety during codes. Not fear of making a clinical mistake. I had never carried that kind of fear before. This was something entirely different. Every time I started compressions on a patient in arrest, I found myself wondering whether they were watching from somewhere above. Every time a physician looked at a flatline and said it was time to stop, I found myself watching the body afterward, waiting. Just waiting. 9 months later, I was caring for a 74-year-old woman after a massive heart attack. After 40 minutes of unsuccessful CPR, the attending made the decision to stop. As I prepared her body for the family, I realized I couldn't stop watching her for movement, for breath, for anything. I stood in that room monitoring a dead woman for signs of impossible life. She didn't come back. But the fact that I was standing there, waiting for it, that told me something I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks later, I submitted my resignation. I told the hospital I was leaving for other opportunities. The truth was simpler and harder. Arthur's case had changed something in me at a level too deep to work around. I had spent 16 years building certainty about death, and in 12 minutes that certainty had been dismantled in a way I couldn't repair. Cardiac critical care requires confidence and decisiveness in exactly the moments where I could no longer find either one. I moved to outpatient cardiology, scheduled appointments, stress tests, follow-ups. No codes, no flat lines, no calls to waiting families. I sleep better now, that much is true. But I think about Arthur every day. He was discharged 5 days later, in perfect health. 2 years on, through mutual contacts, I heard he was still doing well, traveling with Eleanor, spending time with their grandchildren, speaking at medical conferences about what happened to him. The engineer who built components for space shuttles turned out to be harder to break than anyone expected. I don't have a clean conclusion to offer. I don't know what Arthur experienced during those 12 minutes. I don't know whether consciousness can exist outside a living body, or whether the line between life and death is as fixed as we've always assumed. I don't know how many patients in cardiac arrest right now, in hospitals across this country, might be watching from somewhere beyond the reach of our monitors. What I know is this. I held 2 fingers against a dead man's neck and felt his pulse come back. I heard him describe with specific and accurate detail things that happened after we pronounced him dead. And I have never been able to put those 2 facts back into any framework that makes complete sense. You can move to quieter work. You can find a role without the codes and the flat lines. You can sleep better and fill your days with routine, but you carry it with you. The question follows you, steady and patient, the way certain things do. Arthur Kellerman was dead for 12 minutes, and then he was alive. And in those 12 minutes, every certainty I had built over 16 years quietly came apart. I'm still trying to understand what I witnessed that morning. I suspect I always will be.